Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Nice. Anyone here for the first time? Whoa, what happened? We have a newsletter? So you're here for the first time. Are you local?
No, from Seattle.
Oh, welcome. What brings you?
Visiting family.
Uh-huh. Any of your family here? Is it just you? And who else? A couple others. Any of in the back? Are you local?
I am.
You are. Welcome. What's your name?
Gary.
Hi, Gary. And over here?
We're from Oklahoma City,
Ah,
and my cousin Trevor is
Trevor, you brought everyone here. Thank you. Well, my name's Kozan, and I'm one of the priests here. And you find us in the middle of our kind of summer month. And last week, we planted the Three Sisters Garden, which is the garden you can see on this side of the temple as you leave, which has squash, corn, and beans. And any of the local Sangha here for that? Roshi was here for that. Yeah. So that activity, I actually wasn't here for it this year, which I usually am. But this time of year, we generally pick up one of Dogen's fascicles that's entitled The Mountains and Rivers Sutra. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about this fascicle. The cliff notes on Dogen is he's the founder of our lineage, Soto Zen, or the Soto school. And he lived from 1200 to 1253 and was a kind of poet, scholar, monk. And his writings are this kind of beautiful translation of the ancient tradition that still seem quite alive today. So that's Dogen. And this is... well, a lot of us, the residents in a couple weeks, are going to go up to Prajna, which is a refuge up in the mountains where we'll spend 4 or 5 days listening to the mountains and listening to the rivers. And that's what this fascicle is about. But I thought about this fascicle, and the reason we're going to study it tonight, we may not actually ever get to the fascicle, but I'll talk about why it's interesting before we get there, and then we might actually get there. But I thought about the fascicle because I was remembering the first time I did the planting of the Three Sisters Garden here with Wendy Johnson, who just left about a decade ago now. And those of us who were tending to the garden walked down to the river that morning, very early before we all sat, and we greeted the river, and we took pails, and we drew from the river, and in following our tradition in drawing from the river, we poured back in part of the water. You pour it towards yourself as expression of intimacy with the river, intimacy with all things, instead of pouring away from oneself, which is a kind of objectification or a kind of, it's just water. And that activity was really powerful. It was just relational. We didn't say anything. And it stuck with me, and I was thinking about it because it's that season. And it's that relationality that Dogen points us to in this fascicle. So who's read this fascicle? About a quarter of the room, okay. Anyone want to sum up what he's saying? No? Okay. So one other story about water before we get to the text. We went to Japan, a number of us, a month and a bit back. And we went to Eiheiji, which is Dogen's monastery up in the mountains, the one he founded. And I hadn't seen before, but as you walk into this monastery that's far away from the city and is surrounded by these ancient redwoods, these ancient giant trees, there are 2 stone pillars. I mentioned this a few Wednesdays ago. And the stone pillars read from one side and then the other, at the bottom of a ladle, 1 drop of water. Billions of people scoop water from the river. So this is actually the last 2 lines of a 4-line poem written by the 73rd abbot of Eiheiji. It was the abbot around the turn of the 19th century. And the full 4 lines go, "Main gate meets universe. An ancient road has disappeared into the red dust. At the bottom of a ladle, 1 drop of water left. Billions of people scoop water from the river." So this has been playing over and over for me since we left. And there's a number of ways we can probably understand it. One is it's a story about Dogen taking a ladle of water from the river and returning half of it to the river. And in some versions of the story, he teach the Dharma to the water before he returned it to the river. And then that teaching went off and fed billions of beings. We can understand it literally as developing a relationship with 1 scoop of water and returning those drops to the source, to a flow of river, knowing that countless beings will interact with that water you returned over eons. That it's not just returning water to a river. And we can understand it relationally to Dogen in that he scooped up kind of the whole world in his life, in his practice, in his own awakening, and he left 1 drop behind. And that 1 drop continues today. We feel it in our practice in this Zendo. That's all it took. So this is his kind of 1 drop teaching. And it's that 1 drop that we listen for in the rivers and in the mountains. Okay, so that brings us to the Mountains and Water Sutra. But before we get to the Mountains and Water Sutra text itself, I want to read to us, before we jump away from relationality to water, which that story and pouring water towards ourselves reminds me of, to bring it to the present, I was just back with some old friends, and they have kids, and this is why I wasn't at the Three Sisters planting. And they were telling me that teachers are being talked to in the classroom the way that they talk to their AI at home. So I don't know if any of you use Siri. I know at least one of us in the room does. But but if you talk to Siri to turn on the lights, to turn off the music, whatever it is, you might start talking to Siri like it's a thing, and a kind of throwaway thing, and not very important. And maybe it's a little demanding, a little curt, a little rough. And then young kids, not knowing exactly the difference, start thinking that's the way to interact with certain beings in the world. And pick it up and start repeating a kind of tone of voice. They notice this because they start mimicking that tone of voice out in the world, particularly with teachers, where they spend most of their day in class. And so there's this retraining of how do we relate to things that we think aren't important, but actually infuse everything else, like a drop of water. So that's our modern version. This is the everything's connected. Okay, back to the fascicle, which isn't yet the fascicle, but is the poem that led to the fascicle, which is an ancient Chinese poem that Dogen would have heard. And it goes like this. The sounds of the valley streams are his long, broad tongue. The mountain his immaculate body. These evenings, 84,000 verses. How can I relate to others what they say? So I'll say it again. The sounds of the valley streams are his long, broad tongue. The mountain his immaculate body. These evenings, 84,000 verses. How could I relate to others what they say? So this sound of the stream, his long, broad tongue, that's the Buddha's tongue. The mountain's immaculate body, the Buddha's body. And this listening and hearing the 84,000, we could say, infinite verses of the Buddha, how could anyone possibly communicate that, share it, hold it, grasp it? So we think for a moment, we realize, oh, this must be impossible. And yet this is what Dogen's doing in this fascicle and in all of his writings, which makes it all the more touching knowing that it can't quite be done. Any effort to translate this experience, these sutras, even the reality of a single moment, is ultimately foolish, while also compassionate. The gap is never closed. The map we draw with words is never the territory drenched with sounds and substances, and that necessarily precede categories like words. So inevitably, this activity is one, as we would say in Zen, of continuous failure. And from the outside, looking in, when we think of this, we think, well, that sounds awful. That must be really rough. But when we embark on this activity with each other, with our lives, maybe even in writing poetry ourselves, when we're within the activity, with all of its flaws and all of its intimacy, it's freeing. We know this. Any of us who've ever sat across from anyone else or drawn a rose, we know this. So this way of talking about Dogen's activity, or talking about our own activity, is only possible, this way of saying the river is the Buddha's body, the mountain, or the Buddha's voice, the mountain is the Buddha's body. It's only possible because of this central kind of ontological turn in Mahayana Buddhism that I just want to touch on so we get what we're talking about. And this turn is the one that asserts the teachings of the Buddha are everywhere and are everywhere available to us. So an earlier form of Buddhism would say the teachings of the Buddha are refer to the historical Buddha, and we can study them and they can inspire us and infuse our life. And Mahayana Buddhism will say, of which Zen is a part, that is true, and we should reference and go back to the teachings of the historical Buddha. And the teachings of the Buddha, the wisdom of the Buddha, is also available right here. Now we just need to learn to listen. And so this is why in Mahayana Buddhism we have many sutras that, although the Buddha may be a kind of central character in them, don't claim to be from the Buddha's time. Right? So the Lotus Sutra is one example. So this is the kind of sutra Dogen's talking about. He's not writing his own sutra. He's not claiming to be the Buddha. He's saying this is the sutra chanted by, sung by mountains and rivers since beginningless time. If you listen right now, you can hear it. And this is important because if we think his words are the sutra, we miss that he's pointing to something that we can, he's kind of pointing to the source that we all have access to. So this is an issue of translation. And I'd like to tell a story. Oh, about translation. He's also writing in Japanese. So for those of you who don't know, he's a Japanese monk. He's writing in an ancient form of Japanese. Almost no one kind of speaks it. No one speaks it. Very few understand it. And so we're translating the Sutra of Mountains and Waters into Japanese, and then translating that Japanese into English over almost 1,000 years. And this issue of translating is really important for any kind of mystical tradition, of which I'd count Zen as one. Anything that is listening for a wisdom that's beyond conventional human knowledge. So what is that activity of translating that we engage in? So it relates to a story, and it's the story of Cadman. Anyone know who Cadman is? Really? Of course, Hunt knows, because I talked to him about it yesterday. So Cadman was, I think, 8th century, maybe, Catholic monk. But before he was a monk, he was a cowherder. And the story about how he becomes a monk and a poet is a story about translation. So here's how this story goes. It's told by Bede, who's a historian that comes about 100 years after him. So the story is that he's a illiterate cowherder tending to land around a monastery, or cows who are grazing around a monastery. And when during this or that merry feast in his day, it was decided that everyone in turn would contribute a song, Cadman would withdraw in embarrassment, maybe claiming he had to go look after his animals. And one night, somebody tries to pass Cadman the harp after dinner, and he flees to the stable. And there, among the ungulates, he drifts off and is visited by a mysterious figure. "You must sing to me," says this figure. Maybe it's God, or we could say it's Buddha, or a demon perhaps, or his unconscious mind, but since it's a Christian story, we'll call this figure God. He says, "I can't," in return. "That's why I'm sleeping in the stable instead of drinking mead with my friends around the fire." But God keeps demanding a song. "What should I sing?" asks Cadman, who we might imagine is desperate at this point, nervous about the prospect of coming home empty-handed, or coming up empty-handed in front of the divine. And so this figure says, "Sing of the beginning of created things." Cadman opens his mouth and, to his amazement, gorgeous verses come forth, praising God and creation. That night, Cadman awakes a poet. But the poem he sings upon waking is not, according to Bede, as good as the poem he sang in his dream. This is Bede's words now. "For songs, be they never so well made, cannot be turned of one tongue into another, word for word, without loss to their grace and worthiness." So if that's true of translation in the waking world, it must be doubly so for translation from dream to waking life. The actual poem that Cadman brings back to his human community is necessarily an echo of the first. So Ben Lerner, where I get this story, is a novelist and a poet, and he draws a lesson about poetry that'll help for our lesson about our practice. He says, "Poetry arises from the desire to get beyond the finite and historical, the human world of violence and difference, and to reach the transcendent or the divine. You're moved to write a poem. You feel called upon to sing because of that transcendent impulse. But as soon as you move from that impulse to the actual poem, the song of the infinite is compromised by the finitude of its terms. In a dream, your verse can defeat time. Your words can shake off the history of their usage. You can represent what can't be represented, such as the creation of representation itself. But when you wake, when you rejoin your friends around the fire, you're back in the human world with its inflexible laws and logic." So back to Dogen. For Dogen, and for us, the sublime is not necessarily found in dreams as much as the present waking moment. We call this experience emptiness or boundlessness or original nature. And yet it's not so different in an important way from Cadman's dream, in that there's an apparent divide between the world of form and the world of emptiness. We practice dwelling in each to understand the unique texture of each, even as we continuously work to close the gap. For one perspective, there is a gap. From another, there is no gap. This journey occurs in a single breath or over an entire eon. This reminds me of I forget the singer, someone will know it in the room. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. Who sings that song? Donovan. Thank you, thank you. So these two views, of which we think there's a final view, perhaps the merging of the two of which we chant about often in the morning, the Sandokai, and yet they're separate and not separate, right? We hold them as both. So if there's anything to say about Cadman's story, for me it's that it inoculates us against the dangers of becoming enamored with Dogen's words as the teachings themselves, rather than the listening to this moment as the activity of listening to the sutra, which he'll call mountains and rivers. And by mountains and rivers in the broadest sense, he only means the non-separation of all things that we assume are different, we assume are separate. And he'll attribute that to mountains and rivers and allow us to feel what that means. Should we read the sutra or should I skip the sutra? Will you read the sutra? You want to read the sutra? Ash has her journal out ready to write things down, so I feel like we should actually read the sutra. Okay, here are the opening words of the Mountains and Waters Sutra. Dogen writes, mountains and waters right now are the actualization of the ancient Buddha way. Each abiding in its phenomenal expression realizes completeness. Because mountains and waters have been active since before the empty eon, they are alive at this moment. Because they have been the self since before form arose, they are emancipation realization. So let's start with the first sentence. Mountains and waters right now are the actualization of the ancient Buddha way. So Shohaku Okumura has a wonderful book on this. If your interest is piqued by this talk and you want to read a really beautiful gloss. And he says of this opening sentence that the entirety of Dogen's writings is included in this one sentence. So we could simplify the sentence to read, mountains and waters right now are ancient Buddhas. Mountains and waters right now are ancient Buddhas. Then we need to ask ourselves, what are mountains? What are waters? What is right now? And what are ancient Buddhas? Dogen might say something like, investigate this thoroughly. Once we have studied each of these things, we can begin to understand the density of Dogen's opening sentence. But even before we've investigated each one of these thoroughly, we can still understand them. We just don't know what it is that we understand. And this is just fine. It's the joy of reading Dogen as if listening to the river. We understand even when we don't know what it is we understand. And although this is enough, we can't help but wanting it to be more. So I'll read that opening sentence again. Mountains and waters right now are the actualization of the ancient Buddha way. He goes on, each abiding in its phenomenal expression realizes completeness. So what does this mean? Each abiding in its phenomenal expression realizes completeness. So we might say each one abides in its unique conditions, just as we all abide in our unique conditions. Now, what we know about us in general is that although we abide in unique conditions, we don't always love our unique conditions. So we often desire things to be otherwise. Maybe you want to be taller or younger or more talented. Maybe we want someone to like us more than they do, or to like someone more than we do. Perhaps we regret the pains we've endured and the sharp bends in the river of our life. And this is a very odd and human thing, since at the same time we're well aware that there's no way to be anything but who and where we are. So he's pointing out, mountains. How do they abide in their causes and conditions? They don't need to coax themselves to accept it. They don't get jealous of a taller mountain across the way. When it's spring, they bloom. When it's winter, they're covered in snow. Sometimes they grow tall, other times they erode and they fall into plains. They don't resist the cycle of walking as mountains, as he'll say soon. So it gives us a kind of invitation. How can we fully express this marvelous and infinite collection of causes and conditions at this moment? He goes on, because mountains and waters have been active since before the empty eon, they are alive at this moment. Because mountains and waters have been active since before the empty eon, they are alive at this moment. Someone the other day asked, what is the empty eon? Yeah. He clearly means kind of beginningless time. And there's some language in here about the kind of chapters of the universe, these eons or epochs, that in Buddhist lore, the universe is broken into. We don't have to go into all of them, but essentially they're very long. Like each one is as long as it would take Mount, what is it? What's that? Is it Mount Meru? Essentially a non-existent mountain, but let's imagine a very tall mountain, to be whittled down by a feather of a bird, of a hawk. So however long that would take is an eon. And there are many of these eons, and it expands our mind to imagine life as much bigger than we usually imagine life. And the first eon, this empty eon where nothing's there, even before that, these mountains and rivers had their beginning, and we had our beginning. So because mountains and waters have been active since before the empty eon, they're alive at this moment. So here he's saying mountains and waters don't exist within a specific window of time. Well, that's odd. They seem like they exist within a specific window of time. Snow melts, a river's created, dries up eventually, maybe after many hundreds of years, and it doesn't seem to be there anymore. But Dogen writes this fascicle a week and a bit after he writes Uji. And Uji is his fascicle, Being Time, which is another famous and beautiful fascicle about time. And it must be very much on his mind at this point. And so in this central theme, things don't arise and fall the way we think they do. They don't come into being and kind of fall out of being the way we would conventionally see it, which includes us. We're not kind of born when our mother gives birth. The notion is that we are not in time, so we couldn't be out of time. Time is not a room we walk into, not a room we walk out of. We're made of time. So if we're made of time, our beginning or our being is without end, or you could say without a beginning. Does that make sense? A little bit. I have nods, but then I have a few blank stares. In other words, to begin time is a kind of conundrum. And if we identify as time itself, that conundrum is our conundrum. Okay, he goes on. It's settled, right? Because they have been the self since before form arose, they are emancipation actualized. So this is Koz's translation. We also have Bielefeld's translation, which is useful here, because it's a little different in the second half. He says, because they have been the self since before form arose, same statement, they are liberated in their actual occurrence. They're liberated in their actual occurrence. What does this mean? So we might have the notion that we're infinite. It's not such an unusual notion. And we might have the notion that we have a body and we exist in this time. And so this infinite thing that's undifferentiated is in this finite form. And we might have a notion alongside that that's kind of a bummer. That this infinite thing is imprisoned in this finite life. And we want to feel the kind of infinite essence that gave us birth, or that is what we return to when we die. And Dogen's flipping that as he's kind of flipping everything in this sutra, in this fascicle, and saying it's because we have this body and all of these apparent problems, and that we're in this room right now, and maybe it's too hot, and maybe we're hungry, and maybe our knees ache. It's because of all these finite and specific things that we're free, that we can live fully in the experience of being here and now, rather than being everywhere, at all times. Yeah, we could leave that there. So he goes on, and this is kind of the famous part of the fascicle. He says, because mountains are high and broad, the way of riding the clouds is always reached in the mountains. The inconceivable power of soaring in the wind comes freely from the mountains. Priest Dao Kai of Mount Furong said to the assembly, "The green mountains are always walking. A stone woman gives birth to a child at night." The green mountains are always walking. A stone woman gives birth to a child at night. So this doesn't sound right. The mountains are walking? A stone woman, a barren woman, gives birth to a child? Well, that's just kind of gibberish now. I mean, it's not so helpful. So I'll read it again and just see what you feel rather than what you hear. Because mountains are high and broad, the way of riding the clouds is always reached in the mountains. The inconceivable power of soaring in the wind comes freely from the mountains. Priest Dao Kai of Mount Furong said to the assembly, "The green mountains are always walking. A stone woman gives birth to a child at night." So here's what I hear. I hear him saying the world is not as it appears to be. Mountains are miraculous. You are miraculous. And more miraculous than our conceptual and conventional views allow us to be. So let's take the first one, mountains walking. Well, we don't think of mountains walking. That goes against our conventional view of seeing a mountain as a stoic, still, brilliant, tall, kind of weighty thing. How could it possibly walk? And we have a kind of conventional view about this, and this conventional view is repeated, maybe even without noticing it, again and again throughout our life, until it becomes certainty. And then we wake up one day and we hear a sentence like this and we think, well, that's not true, and we're certain it's not true. But how did we get so certain? Where'd it come from? What's it made of? And are we holding tightly to it? When did that happen? So all that might come up when someone like Dogen tells you a mountain is walking. And this might not be such a big deal. Why does it matter that he's saying mountains walking and we have a kind of upside down view that they aren't? But the reason it matters is because our conceptual way of thinking, our kind of conventional way of thinking, closes us off to each other and to the world. So we become certain, and we become certain about things like me and you are separate. And that separateness is actually useful. Maybe it keeps us safe. And this certainty keeps us distant not only from the world, but eventually from ourselves, and closes off our hearts. So this is the kind of consequence that follows from beliefs we hold. And so Dogen's doing something very fundamental. He's exploding a very simple, cherished concept, something we know, and asking, well, could you hold it more loosely? And it's not just about mountains walking. So he goes on, mountains do not lack the quality of mountains. Therefore, they always abide in ease and always walk. You should examine in detail this quality of mountains walking. Mountains walking is just like human walking. The Buddha ancestors' words point to walking. This is fundamental understanding. You should examine the characteristics of mountains walking. I knew we'd get there. So we should examine the characteristics of mountains walking. And we can do this. When we're in the mountains, we feel alive. We feel them changing. I was thinking the other day, I could remember the trees on the ridge up near, above Prajna. And they sway, right? They kind of shimmer. You can't see the leaves, but you can see the shimmer in the wind. And then you look at your own forearm in the wind, and you see the same ridge, the same trees in your own body. And you get this sense when you spend enough time in the mountains that they're quite alive and that they're always moving and everything's curved and changing. And then, what about this walking? They don't seem to walk with feet or legs. They don't seem to walk like we do. And yet, we can feel this kind of constant moving. So we already talked about long time, eons. We could imagine geological time and mountains getting higher and lower and changing over time. I was talking to someone the other day who was in the Midwest and had lived in the Northwest, in Washington, by the mountains. They were in the plains now, and it was raining. And they said they could feel the mountain that they had lived next to in the rain. Because, of course, that's where the rain had come from. And so they could feel the mountains thousands of miles away in that moment, walking right in that moment. This is the kind of feeling you get when you think about the movement of everything. And we can study this, and it can loosen our certainty about how the world is. And this might be useful for us. And this studying applies to our own life as well. This is what we do on the cushion, of course. We sit and we examine things just as they are in that moment. We don't make a bunch of assumptions. We don't add a bunch of conventional stories. We just sit and in a moment fully investigate the nature of life in that moment. And so whether it's up in the mountains or sitting on the cushion here in the Zendo or at home, the sense of the mountains walking and our own walking, the mountains life and our own life being separate starts to drop away. And this is our activity this month and maybe for many months to come. We're going to read Dogen's Mountains and Waters Sutra, and I didn't even get to the water part, but there's a couple more Dharma talks coming up, and maybe we'll continue reading this sutra. We can go this month, the beauty of these long days, and go sit next to a river up in the mountains and listen to the sutra itself. And we can sit still and upright here or anywhere and listen to our lives. And in that, allowing the gap between mountains, waters, Dogen, me, and you to fade in and out of existence. So I hope there is enough water in all the oceans of the world to wash out my words from your ears. I mean that sincerely. You can forget everything that was said. And I'd love to close with a bit of a poem from Joy Harjo, our poet laureate of prior years, but also our local poet. So this poem's called Praise the Rain. Praise the rain, the seagull dive, the curl of plant, the raven talk. Praise the hurt, the house slack, the stand of trees, the dignity. Praise the dark, the moon cradle, the sky fall, the bear sleep. Praise crazy, praise sad. Praise the path on which we're led. Praise the roads on earth and water. Praise the eater and the eaten. Praise beginnings, praise the end. Praise the song and praise the singer. Praise the rain, it brings more rain. Praise the rain, it brings more rain. Thank you all for your practice. What a joy to be together tonight.